Now that you understand how to create and save lights luminosity selections and how to create masks from those selections, what about selections for the dark tones? Masks for the dark values can also be created, but an extra step is necessary. Let's start with our gradient layer to help us visualize the selections. The additional step is to first make a light selection as we did before, and then invert the selection by clicking Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I on a Mac, or going to the Select menu and choosing Inverse. The inverse of a 50% light selection is a 50% dark selection. Save this selection as a channel and name it Darks. Inspecting the selection, our gradient reveals that we are now making selections based on the darker tones in the image. Notice that the darkest area of the gradient is lighter in the channel. That means that any mask created from this selection will target adjustments more towards the darker areas of the image and less towards the lighter areas of the image. Now let's generate the other dark selections from our initial darks channel using the same procedure that we did with our light selections. Hold down the Control-Alt-Shift or Command-Option-Shift and click again on the darks channel. Now save that and name it Dark Darks. Now Control-Alt-Shift or Command-Option-Shift, click on the Dark Darks, save that, and name it Shadow Darks. And finally, Control-Alt-Shift or Command-Option-Shift, click on the Shadow Darks and save that, naming it Super Darks. We now have an entire range of darks masks. Notice how each selection has shifted more towards the darker tones within the gradient. Each one is more isolated to the darker tonal values in the image and will increasingly allow the lighter values to be unaltered by any adjustment. If we look at what the actual masks would look like for each of those selections, we see that it's the darkest areas in the mask that are the lightest. And it's those light areas in a mask that will allow the adjustment to have an effect and constrain the adjustment in the darkest areas of the image. As with the light selections, the updated version of Tony's Actions takes advantage of the finer tonal selections we get with the correct color and gray space pairings. The updated actions will now create an ultra dark selection. The ultra dark selection is created by intersecting the super darks channel with itself. An ultra darks mask is equivalent to making 16 individual 50% selections of the darks channel, so it really confines adjustments to all but the very darkest parts of an image. Now that we've seen how this works with the gradient, let's build the darks masks for an actual image. I'm going to start by deleting these two curves adjustment layers that we made in the last segment. Now I'm going to control click on the lights channel to create that initial light selection, and then I'm going to type Control-Shift-I to invert that selection and save it. And this is our initial dark selection. Now we can continue making selections with that original darks mask. So Control-Alt-Shift click or Command-Option-Shift click on the darks with that selection already active, and the second selection will create our darks. And now we can Control-Alt-Shift or Command-Option-Shift click and save to create our shadow darks. And finally, the final click and save will generate our super darks. And to make sure that these tutorials are current with Tony's most up-to-date actions, let's intersect the Super Darks mask with itself and create the Ultra Darks mask. Now let's evaluate these channels that we've created. I'm going to start by deselecting the active selection, Control or Command D. And let's take a look at that original lights mask we made. And we can see, as we saw before, that it's the brightest areas of the clouds in the sky and the rock that are most affected by adjustments when using this as a mask with an adjustment layer. If we look at the darks mask, we see that it's the exact inversion. That those brightest areas of the image are darkest in the mask, so they will be the least affected by any adjustments. And it's these darkest areas of the image that are the lightest in the mask and will be most affected by our adjustments. The darks mask targets those darkest areas even more. Shadow darks takes it a step further. And in the super darks mask, we can see that it's really just the darkest areas of the reflection and the darkest areas of the rock that will be affected by our adjustments, leaving the sky and clouds and the brightest areas of the rock almost entirely unaffected. Now let's compare adjustments made through two different darks masks. I'm going to start with our initial darks mask by Control or Command clicking on it to make the initial selection, and then I will create a curves adjustment layer. And we can see that that curves adjustment layer does indeed come with the darks mask represented. And any adjustment we make to the curve, dragging it down to darken the image or dragging it up to lighten the image, is affecting the image through that mask. So we can see here that the lightest areas of the image in the sky and in the bright rock are not being affected very much by this adjustment, while the darkest areas, like in the reflection in the darker areas of the rock, are being affected quite a bit. So let's use this adjustment to lighten up some of the dark areas. Now I'm going to turn that off and now make a selection with the Super Darks channel. So Control or Command click and now generate a curves adjustment layer with that mask. We can see that this mask should do a much better job of constraining any adjustment just to the very darkest portions of the image, which are very light in the mask. Dragging down that curve indeed is darkening the reflection and the shadow areas in the cracks of the rock, and dragging it up is lightening those areas, but notice that the lightest areas in the sky and in the rock are really completely unaffected. So let's leave that like that. And now let's compare the two adjustments. This is our adjustment through this Super Darks mask. I'm going to turn that off. And let's compare that adjustment through the regular darks mask. So you can see the lightest values have been affected more here than they are here. And it's always interesting to completely deactivate the mask to see what the adjustment would look like without the mask present. Shift click on the mask and you can see that adjustment without the mask controlling how it's being applied is really a whole different adjustment. And if we turn off this adjustment and turn on this one, we can also see the effect that this mask is having. We're making great progress. Not only do we now know how to make selections and masks for the lightest tones in the image, but we can also make them now for the darkest tones in the image.